Imagine this. It's June 1944. You're a soldier in the Allied Army, pushing through the French countryside just days after D-Day. Your tank column has been making good progress, village after village fallen to your advance. The German army is retreating, but they're not going quietly. Every bridge they cross, they destroy. Every river becomes a barrier, and you're stuck on the wrong side, watching your momentum die as engineers scramble to figure out how to get thousands of tons of armor and equipment across water that might as well be an ocean. This was the reality of World War II in Europe. Rivers weren't just natural obstacles, they were tactical nightmares. The Seine, the Rhine, the Po, dozens of smaller waterways crisscrossing France, Belgium, Italy, and Germany. Each one represented a potential halt to Allied operations. Each destroyed bridge meant days, sometimes weeks of delay, while engineers worked frantically to build a replacement strong enough to handle Sherman tanks weighing 30 tons each. And the Germans knew this. Their retreat strategy was brutally simple and devastatingly effective. Blow the bridges, force the Allies to slow down, buy time to regroup, reinforce, and prepare the next defensive line. It worked again and again. The Allied advance that should have been a sprint became a crawl, measured not in miles per day but in bridges rebuilt per week. Traditional military bridge building in 1944 was an exhausting, dangerous process. Engineers needed heavy equipment, cranes, welding gear, and most critically, time. A typical temporary military bridge took anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks to construct, depending on the span and the conditions. And that's assuming you had all the materials, all the equipment worked, and nobody was shooting at you while you worked. But what if there was another way? What if you could build a bridge that didn't need cranes or welding? What if regular soldiers, not specialized engineers, could assemble it using nothing but hand tools and muscle? What if you could throw up a bridge strong enough for the heaviest tanks in just hours, not days? That sounds impossible, right? The kind of thing that belongs in science fiction, not on a battlefield. But in World War II, one man made it real. And his invention didn't just change military engineering. It arguably changed the entire course of the war in Europe. This is the story of the Bailey Bridge, the modular marvel that military historians credit with helping win World War II. And more incredibly, it was invented by a man who wasn't a soldier, wasn't a commander, wasn't even famous. Just a quiet civil engineer who had an idea that would save thousands of lives and change warfare forever. Let's go back to 1940. Britain is reeling from Dunkirk. The army has evacuated from France, leaving behind virtually all of its heavy equipment. The country is preparing for potential invasion, and the military is desperately trying to rebuild, re-equip, and rethink how to fight a modern war. One of the problems they're facing is mobility. How do you move an army quickly when bridges are destroyed? How do you keep tanks and trucks moving forward when every river becomes a week-long pause? Enter Donald Bailey. He's 41 years old in 1940, working as a civil engineer in the British War Office. He's not on the front lines. He's not commanding troops. He's a desk guy, a technical expert brought in to solve engineering problems, and he's been thinking about bridges. Specifically, he's been thinking about how ridiculous it is that building a temporary military bridge requires so much specialized equipment and so much time. Bailey had a simple insight, the kind of obvious in hindsight idea that seems trivial until you realize nobody had ever done it before. What if a bridge wasn't one big structure but a bunch of identical interchangeable parts? What if each piece was small enough and light enough that regular soldiers could carry it? What if the pieces locked together so simply that you didn't need welding or riveting or any specialized tools? It sounds simple. It wasn't. Bailey spent months working out the mathematics, the load calculations, the stress tolerances. He needed each piece to be light enough for 6 men to carry, but strong enough that, when assembled, the bridge could support a 40-ton tank. He needed the connections between pieces to be foolproof, something exhausted soldiers could assemble correctly even under fire, even at night. He needed the design to be flexible, so the same basic components could be configured into different lengths and strengths depending on what was needed. By early 1941, Bailey had his design. The core component was a panel, a steel lattice frame that measured 10 feet long and 5 feet wide. Each panel weighed about 600 pounds. Heavy, but manageable for a team of 6 soldiers. The genius was in how the panels connected. They had pins and slots that locked together with just a sledgehammer. No bolts, no welding, no special tools, just steel hitting steel. But panels alone don't make a bridge. Bailey's system included everything needed: stringers that ran lengthwise to support the deck, cross beams, the actual roadway sections that vehicles would drive on, and ramps at each end. Every piece was standardized, interchangeable, and designed to be assembled in sequence. The construction method was almost like building with Lego, if Lego bricks weighed half a ton and had to support tanks. The British military was skeptical at first. They'd seen plenty of theoretical designs that failed in practice. So in 1941, they told Bailey to build a prototype, not on paper, a real bridge. Bailey and a team of engineers assembled a 30-foot span in a field in England. They tested it with trucks, with tanks, with everything they could throw at it. The bridge held. More than held, it exceeded every strength requirement. But there was still doubt. Could regular soldiers, not engineers, actually build this thing in combat conditions? In May 1941, the British Army ran a field test. They gave a company of infantry soldiers, guys who normally carried rifles, not wrenches, a pile of Bailey Bridge components and basic instructions. The soldiers had never seen the bridge before. They had no special training. They were told to figure it out and build a 60-foot bridge. They did it in 3 hours. The officers watching were stunned. This wasn't engineers with cranes. This was regular infantry assembling a structure capable of supporting tanks in less time than it took to cook dinner. The British Army immediately ordered mass production. By 1942, Bailey bridges were rolling off production lines across Britain. But here's where the story gets interesting. The British shared the design with their American allies, and the U.S. Army's engineers took one look at the Bailey Bridge and recognized it for what it was, a game changer. The Americans didn't just adopt the design, they supercharged it. U.S. factories began producing Bailey Bridge components under license, churning out thousands of panels, stringers, and deck sections. American engineering battalions trained on the system, practicing assembly till they could put up spans in their sleep. By 1943, Bailey bridges were standard equipment in both the British and American armies. Thousands of sets of components were pre-positioned, ready to be trucked forward whenever needed. The Allies had transformed bridge building from a bottleneck into a routine operation. But the real test was still coming. The real test was D-Day, June 6, 1944. Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. The initial landings are successful, but now comes the hard part, pushing inland. And France, especially Normandy, is crisscrossed with rivers and streams. The Germans, retreating as planned, blow every bridge they pass. Within days of D-Day, the Allied advance is facing the same old problem, rivers without crossings. Tanks stuck on one side, supplies on the other, momentum bleeding away. But this time, it's different. This time, the Allies have Bailey bridges, and they use them everywhere. One of the first major uses comes just days after D-Day, near Carrington. The Germans destroy a bridge over the Douve River, expecting the usual week-long delay, while the Allies figure out what to do. American engineers arrive with Bailey Bridge components already loaded on trucks. They survey the site, do quick calculations, and start assembling. Soldiers haul panels into position. Sledgehammers ring out as pins lock sections together. The structure grows foot by foot, section by section. 12 hours later, there's a bridge, a fully functional, tank-capable bridge where yesterday there was nothing but a gap. Sherman tanks roll across, infantry follows, and the advance continues. The Germans, expecting days of breathing room, suddenly have American armor in their rear areas less than 24 hours after blowing the bridge. The defense collapses. This scene repeats across Normandy. Engineers become experts at rapid bridge deployment. They develop techniques to speed assembly even further. They pre-position components at likely river crossing sites. They create specialized teams who do nothing but build Bailey bridges, moving from site to site as the front advances. The fastest crews get a 90-foot bridge operational in under 10 hours, including site preparation. That's for a structure capable of supporting multiple tanks simultaneously. But Normandy is just the beginning. As the Allies break out and race across France in late summer 1944, Bailey bridges become even more critical. The most famous example is the Seine River crossing in August 1944. The Seine is one of France's major rivers, wide, deep, and crossed by numerous bridges, all of which the Germans destroy during their retreat from Paris. General Patton's Third Army, racing to cut off the German withdrawal, reaches the Seine and finds nothing, no bridges, no ferries, just a wide river and a retreating enemy on the far side. Traditional military thinking says you're stuck for at least a week. Time to bring up bridging equipment, scout sites, plan the construction. Patton has other ideas. He radios for Bailey Bridge components and tells his engineers they have 24 hours. The engineers think he's crazy. The Seine at this point is over 200 feet wide in places. That's not a small stream, that's a major river. Building a 200-foot Bailey Bridge under fire in 24 hours? Impossible. They do it in 18. Working through the night, under sporadic German artillery fire, American engineers assemble one of the longest Bailey bridges yet constructed in combat. They use every trick they've learned. They build the bridge on one bank, assembling it horizontally, then launch it across the river using rollers and manual pushing. Hundreds of soldiers heave on ropes, inching tons of steel out over the water. If the calculations are wrong, if the structure isn't balanced right, the whole thing could collapse into the river. It doesn't. The bridge settles onto the far bank just after dawn. By 8 a.m., Patton's tanks are rolling across. The Germans, who thought they'd bought days of time by destroying the bridges, find American armor on their side of the Seine before they've even finished establishing their new defensive positions. The entire German withdrawal strategy in this sector collapses. Units that could have escaped are cut off and captured. Patton's Third Army maintains its momentum, and the liberation of France accelerates. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, later writes about the Seine crossing. He calls the Bailey Bridge one of the most important pieces of military equipment of the war. Not a tank, not a plane, not a gun, a bridge. But the story doesn't end in France. In Italy, the mountainous terrain creates even more challenging river crossings. The Germans used the geography brilliantly, blowing bridges in narrow valleys where there are no alternate routes. Each river becomes a natural fortress. And the Allies respond with Bailey bridges. One notable case comes in the Italian Alps in late 1944. A key bridge over a gorge is destroyed, and the only detour would add 2 days to the advance. British engineers assess the situation. The gorge is 150 feet across and has steep, unstable sides. Building a Bailey Bridge here would normally be considered too risky. The ground isn't stable enough for traditional foundations. The engineers improvise. They use the Bailey system's modular nature to create a suspended design, anchoring the bridge to bedrock on both sides and essentially hanging the span across the gorge. It's not in any manual, it's not how the bridge was designed to be used. But the modular pieces are so versatile that creative engineers can adapt them to situations Bailey never imagined. The improvised bridge holds. Supply trucks roll through. The advance continues. The Germans, who thought the gorge was impassable without the bridge, find themselves facing Allied units that should have been stuck 2 days behind. Throughout 1944 and into 1945, Bailey bridges become ubiquitous. They appear everywhere the Allies advance, in Belgium, in Holland, in Germany itself. During Operation Market Garden, the failed attempt to seize bridges in Holland in September 1944, Bailey bridges are used extensively. When the plan fails to capture the bridge at Arnhem intact, engineers immediately begin constructing Bailey alternatives at every river crossing they control. The British Second Army, pushing through Belgium and Holland, travels with dedicated Bailey Bridge companies. These units carry enough components to build multiple bridges and can deploy them within hours of reaching a blown crossing. The speed of advance isn't limited by rivers anymore. It's limited only by fuel, ammunition, and the speed of the trucks. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the final major river barrier before the heart of Germany, Bailey Bridge technology has evolved even further. Engineers can now construct double and triple story Bailey bridges, stacking panels to create structures capable of handling even heavier loads. They build bridges in sections on both banks of a river, then float them into position and connect them in the middle. They create floating Bailey bridges, mounting the panels on pontoons for use where riverbeds are too soft for traditional foundations. The Germans, watching this engineering wizardry, are demoralized. One of their key defensive strategies, blow the bridges and buy time, has become nearly useless. Every river they retreat across, the Allies bridge within hours. There's no breathing space, no time to regroup. The Allied advance becomes relentless. German engineering officers, after the war, admit they have nothing comparable. Their military bridges require specialized equipment and trained engineers. They take days to construct. They can't understand how the Allies are bridging rivers overnight with what appears to be random soldiers and hand tools. When they capture Bailey Bridge components and examine them, they're amazed at the elegant simplicity. Each piece is straightforward, but the system as a whole is revolutionary. By war's end, the Allies have built over 700 miles of Bailey bridges. That's not 700 bridges. That's 700 miles of continuous bridging. Some are 10 feet long, replacing culverts. Some are over 1,000 feet, spanning major rivers. All built with the same basic components, all assembled by soldiers who, few years earlier, were civilians, all constructed in a fraction of the time traditional bridges would have required. General Eisenhower, in his post-war memoir, credits the Bailey Bridge with shortening the war in Europe. He argues that without it, every river crossing would have taken days or weeks longer. Those delays would have added up to months. Months for the Germans to build more weapons, train more soldiers, fortify more positions. The war could have extended well into 1946 with tens of thousands more casualties on both sides. But there's a quieter, less dramatic impact that's equally important: medical evacuation. In 1944, getting wounded soldiers from the front lines to field hospitals was a race against time. The faster a wounded soldier received treatment, the better their chances of survival. And wounded soldiers traveled the same roads as supplies, crossing the same rivers, using the same bridges. Every time a bridge was out, medical evacuation times increased. Ambulances had to take longer routes, drive further, delay treatment. With Bailey bridges, evacuation routes stayed open. Wounded soldiers reached hospitals hours faster. Military medical historians estimate that the improved evacuation times made possible by rapid bridge construction saved thousands of lives. Soldiers who would have died from blood loss or shock if treatment had been delayed by bridge outages survived because a Bailey bridge got them to a surgeon in time. Then there's the supply situation. Modern armies run on logistics. Tanks need fuel and ammunition. Soldiers need food and medicine. Artillery needs shells. Every day of combat consumes tons of supplies that have to be trucked forward from rear depots. And every blown bridge in the supply line creates a bottleneck. Trucks back up. Supplies pile up on the wrong side of rivers. Frontline units run short of essentials. Bailey bridges kept supplies moving. When a bridge went down, it was back up in hours. Supply trucks barely slowed. Frontline units stayed equipped, stayed fed, stayed in the fight. The Germans, by contrast, constantly suffered supply shortages, partly because their own retreating forces kept blowing bridges that their own supply columns then couldn't cross. There's also a psychological element that's hard to quantify, but impossible to ignore. For Allied soldiers, knowing that engineers could bridge any river overnight was encouraging. They didn't feel trapped or stuck. They trusted that if they reached an obstacle, somebody would solve it quickly. That confidence affected morale and aggressiveness. For German soldiers, the reverse was true. They couldn't understand how the Allies kept coming. No matter how many bridges they destroyed, Allied tanks appeared on the other side within a day. It seemed like the Allies had infinite resources, infinite engineering capability. That perception, that sense of fighting an unstoppable force, damaged German morale and contributed to the collapse of resistance in the final months of the war. Donald Bailey, the man who made it all possible, didn't become famous during the war. He continued working as a civil engineer in the British War Office, improving the design, solving problems, helping train engineers. He was knighted in 1946 for his contribution to the war effort, but he remained a quiet, modest man who rarely gave interviews or sought attention. In one of the few interviews he did give, Bailey was asked what he thought about people calling his bridge the invention that won the war. He reportedly said that sounded like an exaggeration, that wars are won by soldiers, not bridges. But then he added, with typical engineer practicality, that he was pleased the bridge worked as intended and served its purpose. That undersells it. The Bailey Bridge didn't just work as intended, it exceeded every expectation. It was used in ways Bailey never planned, in conditions he never anticipated, by soldiers who adapted and innovated with the basic design. The bridge was so good that it's still in use today. Yes, today. 80 years after Bailey designed it, the Bailey Bridge remains a standard piece of military equipment in armies around the world. Modern versions use stronger steel and have higher weight capacities, but the basic design, modular panels that pin together, hasn't changed. It didn't need to change. Bailey got it right the first time. Beyond military use, Bailey bridges have become standard emergency equipment for civilian disasters. When floods wash out bridges, when earthquakes collapse crossings, when infrastructure fails, Bailey bridges appear. They're fast to deploy, don't require specialized equipment, and can be installed by crews with minimal training. After Hurricane Katrina in 2005, Bailey bridges provided critical access to isolated communities. After the 2010 Haiti earthquake, they reconnected broken transportation networks. The design has been adopted and adapted worldwide. Chinese engineers use Bailey Bridge principles to create rapid bridge systems for their massive infrastructure projects. Engineers in developing nations use Bailey-style bridges as permanent structures in remote areas where traditional bridge construction is too expensive or too slow. The basic concept, lightweight, modular, strong, has proven universally applicable. But let's return to World War II, because that's where the Bailey Bridge proved its worth in the most dramatic way possible. Consider this counterfactual. What if Bailey hadn't invented his bridge? What if the Allies had been stuck with traditional military bridging equipment throughout the war? Every river crossing takes 3 to 7 days longer. The advance from Normandy that took 3 months now takes 5 or 6. The Seine crossing that happened in 18 hours now takes a week and a half. Patton's breakthrough doesn't happen. The German army has time to establish new defensive lines, time to bring up reinforcements, time to turn every river into a prolonged battle. The war in Europe, which ended in May 1945, extends into late 1945 or even 1946. The human cost is staggering. Tens of thousands more Allied casualties, hundreds of thousands more German military and civilian deaths. The Holocaust continues for additional months with unimaginable consequences. The Soviet advance from the east changes, possibly reaching further into Germany and Western Europe if the Western Allies are moving slower. And the atomic bombs developed in mid-1945 might have been used in Europe if the war was still ongoing. The entire post-war world could be completely different. Now, it's impossible to say the Bailey Bridge alone prevented this alternate timeline. Wars are complex, with thousands of factors influencing outcomes. But military historians broadly agree that the Bailey Bridge was a significant factor in the speed of the Allied advance in 1944 and 1945. It removed a constraint that had limited military operations for centuries. And by removing that constraint, it changed what was possible. That's the mark of a truly revolutionary invention. Not that it does something entirely new, but that it makes something previously difficult become routine. Before Bailey, bridging rivers under combat conditions was a specialized, time-consuming challenge. After Bailey, it was something any trained unit could do in hours. That shift in capability had strategic consequences. There's also a lesson here about innovation and bureaucracy. Bailey wasn't a general or an admiral. He wasn't famous. He was a civil servant, a technical expert working in an office. He saw a problem, applied engineering principles, and created a solution. Then, crucially, the military listened. They tested his idea fairly, recognized its value, and implemented it rapidly. That doesn't always happen. Military bureaucracies, like all bureaucracies, can be resistant to change. New ideas often get buried in committees, delayed by turf wars, or rejected because they don't fit existing doctrine. The Bailey Bridge could easily have been one of those ideas that got shelved or endlessly studied. But in the urgency of World War II, with the British facing potential invasion and desperate for any advantage, good ideas got fast-tracked. Bailey proposed his bridge in early 1941. By late 1941, it was in production. By 1942, it was in use. That's remarkably fast for a major military innovation. It also helps that Bailey's design was so obviously superior to alternatives. When you can build a tank-capable bridge in 10 hours with hand tools versus 5 days with cranes and welding equipment, the choice is pretty clear. The military didn't have to take it on faith that the Bailey Bridge was better. They could test it, see it work, and compare it directly to existing methods. The evidence was overwhelming. And here's something else interesting. The Bailey Bridge succeeded partly because it was designed by someone who wasn't thinking about tradition or what bridges were supposed to look like. Bailey approached the problem from first principles. He asked, what does a bridge actually need to do? Support weight? Span a gap? How can that be achieved most efficiently? Modular components, simple connections. He wasn't constrained by preconceptions about bridge building. That's a pattern you see with many breakthrough innovations. They come from outside the established field, from people who aren't invested in the traditional way of doing things. Bailey wasn't a military engineer. He hadn't spent 20 years building bridges the old way. He just saw a problem and solved it using fresh thinking. Of course, the Bailey Bridge wasn't perfect. It had limitations. The panels were heavy, requiring teams of soldiers to move each one. Assembly, while fast compared to traditional bridges, was still labor-intensive. In extreme cold, the steel became brittle. In extreme heat, it expanded and connections could loosen. Engineers had to adapt techniques for different climates and conditions. But these were minor issues compared to the fundamental advantage the bridge provided. And soldiers and engineers in the field developed workarounds for most problems. Cold weather? Preheat the connection points before assembly. Hot weather? Account for expansion in the initial construction and check connections more frequently. Rough terrain? Use jury-rigged support structures to stabilize panels during assembly. The Bailey Bridge was also not indestructible. German artillery and airstrikes could damage or destroy Bailey bridges just as easily as traditional bridges. But here's the key difference. When a Bailey bridge was damaged, it could be repaired or replaced quickly. Engineers could swap out damaged panels, replace sections, or even rebuild an entire bridge in the time it would take to just assess damage to a traditional structure. This created an interesting tactical dynamic. The Germans would target Bailey bridges, knowing they were critical to Allied logistics. They'd shell them, bomb them, send sabotage teams to blow them up, and the Allies would simply rebuild them. Sometimes, within hours of an attack, the bridge would be operational again. It became a war of attrition the Germans couldn't win. They didn't have unlimited artillery shells or aircraft fuel to keep attacking the same bridge over and over, but the Allies had seemingly unlimited Bailey Bridge components and engineers to install them. As the war moved into Germany in 1945, Bailey bridges even became symbols of Allied victory. Towns and cities that had been cut off by destroyed crossings found themselves reconnected by these steel structures that appeared almost overnight. Civilians watched in amazement as Allied engineers assembled bridges that German engineers said were impossible to build that quickly. There are reports from the final weeks of the war of German officers surrendering to Allied units and immediately asking to see the Bailey bridges. They were fascinated by the engineering. Some German engineers, freed from the burden of fighting, actively helped Allied engineers construct Bailey bridges, treating it as a technical learning opportunity. The bridge transcended sides. It was just such an elegant engineering solution that anyone with technical training had to appreciate it. After the war ended in May 1945, Bailey bridges didn't disappear. They became part of the reconstruction effort. All across Europe, permanent bridges had been destroyed. Rebuilding them with traditional methods would take years. In the meantime, Bailey bridges filled the gaps. Cities reconnected their road networks using Bailey spans. Rural areas restored transportation links. Some of these temporary bridges stayed in place for years, even decades, while permanent replacements were planned and built. Donald Bailey's invention thus had a second life in peacetime reconstruction. The same speed and simplicity that made the bridge useful in war made it valuable in peace. European governments bought thousands of Bailey Bridge sets for civilian use. The British and American governments, eager to help European recovery and also to clear out war surplus equipment, sold or donated Bailey Bridge components across the continent. By the early 1950s, Bailey bridges were everywhere. From Norway to Italy, from Britain to the edges of the Soviet zone, these standardized steel bridges connected communities. Many were eventually replaced by permanent structures, but some are still in use today, quietly carrying traffic as they have for 70-plus years. Bailey himself returned to civilian engineering after the war. He worked on various projects, consulted on bridge designs, and occasionally gave lectures about the development of his most famous invention. He never became wealthy from the bridge. The design was used under military license, and he didn't collect royalties. But he seemed content with the knowledge that his work had made a difference. He died in 1985 at the age of 83, having lived long enough to see his bridge become a standard piece of equipment worldwide and to witness its use in countless military and civilian applications. In obituaries and remembrances, military historians and engineers called him one of the most influential engineers of the 20th century, not for building the tallest bridge or the longest or the most beautiful, but for designing the most practical, the most useful, the bridge that arrived exactly when it was needed most. And that might be the real lesson of the Bailey Bridge. Innovation isn't always about creating something nobody's ever imagined. Sometimes it's about looking at an existing problem and asking if there's a simpler, faster, better way. Bailey didn't invent the concept of a bridge. He just reinvented how bridges could be built. And that reinvention changed the world. Today, when engineers talk about rapid deployment structures, they're building on principles Bailey established. When disaster response teams need to restore access quickly, they're using concepts Bailey pioneered. When military forces plan operations, They know rivers aren't the obstacles they used to be because of what Bailey created. The Bailey Bridge, the impossible bridge that won the war, turns out not to have been impossible at all. It just required someone willing to think differently, to ignore conventional wisdom, and to believe that there had to be a better way. Donald Bailey did that, and in doing so, he saved countless lives, shortened the worst war in human history, and created a tool that continues to serve humanity 80 years later. Not bad for a quiet civil servant who just wanted to solve an engineering problem. You can click in these other videos if you liked this one. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to the channel for more history documentaries.